Notice of motion number 10, resumption of debate on the question that the final report of the Select Committee inquiry into the provision of the University Tasmania Act 1992 be considered and noted. Ms Webb.
The honourable member for Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I had just begun talking about the functions of the university laid out in Section 6 of the Act and listed as A to G in that section, and had mentioned that they're an interesting list, and there was much consideration of them during our inquiry process. And just for clarity and to contextualise the discussion that I'll share here in my contribution, I'm going to read through the functions as they're listed in the Act, and they are these. A, to advance, transmit and preserve knowledge and learning. B, to encourage and undertake research. C, to promote and sustain teaching and research to international standards of excellence. D, to encourage and provide opportunities for students and staff to develop and apply their knowledge and skills. E, to provide educational and research facilities appropriate to its other functions. F, to promote access to higher education having regard to principles of merit and equity. FA, to foster or promote the commercialisation of any intellectual property, and G, to engage in activities which promote the social, cultural and economic welfare of the community, and to make available for those purposes the resources of the university. So, Madam Acting President, there was a discussion then in much evidence to the inquiry of what should be the core functions of universities and whether the list in the current Act was in fact appropriate and fit for purpose. For example, Vice-Chancellor Professor Rufus Black noted during hearings this, and I quote, "Commercial activity is not a function. It is not a purpose of the university. It may be that elements of it are necessary, but that is dealt with in the powers of the Act, which does make an elegant way in which it says, university, be clear this is your task, but in order to do that there are some enabling things. The powers set out, they are quite clear and explicit, a range of capacities to do commercial things in order to fulfil its functions." And further, there were a range of suggestions for additions to the list of functions in the Act. An example that I wish to point to here is from the late distinguished Professor Jamie Kirkpatrick, AM, who suggested the following could be added to Section 6 of the Act after subsection G. And I'll quote the things he suggested could be added. They were H, to engage in activities that promote the ecological sustainability of the university and the broader community, and I, to promote participatory democracy in the university and wider community. And then Professor Kirkpatrick went on to provide a rationale for those, and he said this: "I have added two important functions. The first of these reflects the outstanding achievement of the university in the sustainability area, which is so important to the state and the world. The second exhorts the university to be an exemplar in participatory democracy, to move away from top-down control by a small group of employees." Madam Acting President, I appreciated the suggestions that were made by a number of submitters as to matters that could be considered as changes or additions to the list of functions. I did also note that an interesting area of concern that was raised in evidence was a discrepancy observed between who constitutes the university, who makes up the university, and the functions of the university and the governance structures within it. Accountability was a consistent theme, and the relationship between those different elements in the Act were also seen as either providing or lacking in the provision of accountability. Accountability was explored here in relation to how it is to be assessed and reported on that the university is delivering on the functions in the Act. And I note the late Peter Bachevskis made the following suggestion to improve accountability of the university in this respect. He said this: "There should be a mechanism under the Act for regular independent review of the functioning of the university and adherence to its legislated functions." And I believe this ties into discussion later in the report under term of reference 3 about the annual report of the university, which is tabled in Parliament, and I'll mention it again and pick up that discussion further in that section of my contribution. So, Madam Acting President, the committee made 2 recommendations here in this space relating to functions of the Act. One was recommendation 3, which was that Section 6 of the Act be reviewed and amended to ensure contemporary and appropriate functions are included. And recommendation 4, which was consider a mechanism to assess the performance of the university against the functions in Section 6 of the Act. Both of those elements seem important in terms of ensuring a fit for purpose Act, and also that we build in accountability to the Act where we can. Madam Acting President, this is a good time to mention the committee made an overarching recommendation in this report, which was this. As a priority, the government conduct a comprehensive review of the University of Tasmania Act 1992, including matters specified in recommendations in this report, and promptly legislate the results of that review. Madam Acting President, a comprehensive review of the Act, as per that overarching recommendation made by the committee, would be an appropriate opportunity to then consult more broadly and to give effect to the recommendations which we've articulated in this report through an appropriate legislative developmental process. We didn't presume to specifically draft amendments to the Act or make really particular prognostications about what they should be. More, we pointed to the areas that did require amendment and why, and then looked to a comprehensive review from the government to give effect to that through a proper development process for a reform of a piece of legislation. So, Madam Acting President, moving on to the powers of the university, which are also prescribed in the Act. I note that Emeritus Professor Peter Dawkins AO observed the following in relation to the Constitution, functions and powers as stated in the Act. He said this: the Constitution, functions and powers of the university are very similar to the same sections of the Acts of the University of Melbourne and Victoria University. Universities in Australia are large and complex organisations with multiple objectives and diverse stakeholders. This is evident from the listed functions of the university. The powers conferred on the university by the Act are needed to be successful in this context. In using its powers and carrying out its functions, it needs to be recognised that the university is also subject to the oversight of the Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency, the National Higher Education Regulator, whose job is to ensure the university meets the national higher education standards. A number of witnesses, in fact, expressed concern regarding inconsistency between the powers and the core functions of the university. In particular, a number of witnesses expressed concern in relation to the university's powers under the Act, which give it the ability to pursue for-profit enterprise activities with little relevance to the pursuit of knowledge. As an example of those concerns expressed, I note the quote included in the report from Judy Tierney OAM that the power to conduct business activities is becoming the main focus at the expense of the core roles of the university. She said this: the 1992 Act introduced a new Section 7 with subsection 1 effectively giving UTAS the power and scope to conduct a range of business activities, including share trading, property sale and development, joint ventures and partnerships in pursuit of its ambitions. This is patently becoming the main game for UTAS, with the neglect of its core roles, viz. Academic and research. End of quote. Madam Acting President, the power of the university to sell land gifted to it is a matter of considerable interest, dealt with in this report and of current relevance for this place. The following extract from the Parliamentary Research Service chronology in the report provides relevant context for this, and I'm going to quote from that. I'm going to quote an extract from that. It says this: the University of Tasmania Act 1992 did not include the provision that the Sandy Bay site had to be used for the purposes of a university. The 1951 University Act granted the land in Sandy Bay to the university and stated that if the land ceased to be used for the purposes of a university, it would revert to being Crown land. The Higher Education Amalgamation Act 1990 retained this provision, but it was removed in the drafting of the 1992 Act. Furthermore, Section 26 of the new 1992 Act stated that 26, certain land to remain vested in the university. Notwithstanding the repeal of this Act notwithstanding the repeal by this Act of the Amalgamation Act, the land specified in Schedule 3 remains vested in the university, but free from any restriction as to the power of the university to sell, mortgage or otherwise dispose of that land that may, but for this clause, restrict the power of the university in respect of that land. Accordingly, the University of Tasmania Act 1992 does not place limits on what the university may do with the Sandy Bay site. End of extract. So, Madam Acting President, a briefing paper was prepared for us by the Parliamentary Research Service, providing a short overview of the power to sell and lease land provisions in public university acts in each Australian state and territory. That's in Appendix E of the report. It's very interesting, actually, to see how that's dealt with across the different jurisdictions and different universities. The university, in its evidence to us, outlined its discretion and autonomy to manage its assets to support its core activities. And I'll quote from their submission on that matter. It's important to see how the university regards that. And here's the quote: "Another critical opportunity to overcome structural margin pressures is utilising our existing physical assets to support our access and research agenda that we know the federal funding model cannot fully support. The Act enables the university to manage investments and associated income in a way that supports core university activities. Like many universities, we have an investment portfolio that provides a source of income generation to sustain financial viability, and a funding source for generating new infrastructure that ongoing funding does not provide. Optimising our existing and soon-to-be surplus assets represents one of the most effective ways that we can achieve financial stability in the longer term. If we can do this innovatively and at the right scale, we can insulate the university against these very present and long-standing challenges to benefit current and future generations of Tasmanians. To achieve this, the university has formed a small specialist team and established UTAS Properties Proprietary Limited, a separate wholly owned subsidiary to manage these efforts. By optimising and effectively managing our property assets, we can complete our campus transformation in the north and the south, providing Tasmanians with contemporary best practice facilities and importantly preserving the ability for the university to maintain, adapt and replace this infrastructure into the future, enabling us to focus on our mission of being a university for and from Tasmania." End of quote. So, Madam Acting President, what we also heard, though, from a significant number of submissions made to the inquiry were comments on this subject of the disposal of land that had been gifted to the university. And overwhelmingly, these comments did not agree that the University Council should have the unconstrained power to sell or dispose of public land gifted to the university for educational purposes. Some suggested that the removal of the previous legislative restraint on the sale of gifted land in the 1992 Act would never have contemplated the wholesale disposal of the Sandy Bay campus, for example. Hansard from that debate does not mention such a potential scenario as a possible future consequence of the removal of that previous requirement for ministerial approval. Other evidence reflected on land management strictures in the acts of other universities and suggested changes to the Act here in Tasmania to better align with the approach taken elsewhere. And as an example of that, a quite neat, succinct list is provided by Robert Hogan in his evidence to the inquiry, and I'll quote from his evidence. "Because it is common for universities to operate on land gifted by the community, it is common for the statutes which create universities to contain a requirement that the alienation of land be approved by the responsible minister. Examples include, under the University of South Australia Act 1990, Section 6, the university cannot alienate or lease land for more than 21 years, except with the approval of the Governor. Under the University of Melbourne Act 2009, Section 37, the university cannot alienate or lease land for longer than 21 years without the approval of the Minister. Under the University of Sydney Act 1989, Section 18(2)(a), the university cannot alienate land acquired from the state at nominal or less than market value without approval of the Minister. And under the University of Western Australia Act 1911, Section 15, the university is not permitted to lease land for longer than 21 years without approval of the Minister. So, Madam Acting President, there are many examples in other jurisdictions of this being a common approach, that ministerial or government approval is required for significant alienation of land gifted to universities. And I personally feel strongly about the need to amend the Act to re-establish a requirement for some parliamentary approval for the university to sell or dispose of gifted public land. And of note, the committee on its deliberations has specifically recommended that the Act be amended to provide a constraint or prohibition on the university having the power to sell land gifted to it by the state. As we'll likely debate a bill related to this matter in the near future, I'll not go into further discussion at this point, but I did, because it was such a feature of our deliberations and in many of our submissions and evidence, I did want to put it on the record here in my contribution. Madam Acting President, I'm going to move on to term of reference 2 and the consideration by the committee of that aspect of the terms of reference. It relates to the constitution, role, powers and obligations of the Council and Academic Senate. There have been a number of legislative changes to the governance structures of the University of Tasmania since it was established in 1889. The Parliamentary Research Service provided a briefing paper outlining significant events, which I've mentioned earlier and can be found in Appendix C of the report. In summary, though, the size of the Council of the University has been reduced a number of times, particularly in the last 30 years since the 92 Act came into effect. In the membership of the Council, the proportion of elected academic staff and student representation has been reduced, while the proportion of appointed Council members from outside the University has increased. These changes were legislated in a series of amendments following advice from the Council to various state government education ministers. In the 1980s, the Council had 30 members, including 6 academic staff, 1 member of general staff, 2 elected students and the President of the Tasmanian University Union, and 4 members elected from the alumni. There was also a professorial board at that time which represented academic staff and was responsible for the allocation of resources for academic matters. Following the implementation of the Dawkins reforms, the passage of the University of Tasmania Act 1992 and the amending acts in 2001, 2004 and 2012, the Council has been reduced to its current size and composition, in which it is to operate with a minimum operating level of 10 members and a maximum of 14. The professorial board has been replaced by an academic senate, which is limited to an advisory role, not one that can allocate funding. So, Madam Acting President, a number of submitters to our inquiry commented on the shared managerial academic dual governance model employed by universities and the need for balance in its implementation. And this was another very common tension which is experienced not just by the University of Tasmania, but I think commonly across many universities. As an example of this, Adjunct Associate Professor John Kenny made the following observations on managerialism versus academic decision-making. And this is what he said. In the more corporate university, the values of managerialism, of efficiency, effectiveness, quick decision-making, lines of authority, tend to work against the values that drive academic decision-making. So the two are naturally not going to fit together very well. It is a governance tension that is not unique to UTAS, as I said. It's acknowledged as existing in all universities here in Australia and many international jurisdictions. We do seem to have erred on the side of leaning into the managerialism and configuring our University Council in that way, rather than accepting that tension that exists and continuing to work with it in its complexity. Madam Acting President, the University Council is the supreme governing body of the university. It's clear that changes over time to that key governance structure within the university has had consequences in relation to who is making decisions, the accountability of decision-making back to those who comprise the university and the Tasmanian community. In particular, over time, there was a series of amendments to the Act which resulted in a reduction in both numbers and representation on the University Council. At the time the amendments were made to the Act in 2012, the reason provided was the federal government reforms that were occurring. But some witnesses expressed the view that changes to the composition of the Council, while in line with national reform initiatives, have resulted in a range of negative impacts. These include a decreased focus on education as the core function of the university and an increased focus on business management, a diminished role of academic and student representatives in governance of the university, and the potential for the Council to self-replicate, leading to groupthink without offsetting such a risk with increased accountability requirements elsewhere. So, Madam Acting President, I do also note that there were a small number of submitters who commented favourably on the changes to Council membership and the positive outcomes they regarded it to have in terms of decision-making, including people who had been members of the University Council and so could be trusted to be well informed on such matters. It was identified by university regulatory and governance expert Michael Wells that UTAS was at the lower end of the range in terms of the number of people on the governing body compared to other Australian universities. He suggested that it would certainly be open to consider making additional appointments to the University Council. Perhaps 2 to 4 positions would be appropriate, and that would still be in a very average range in terms of numbers on a governing body. I note also that, as is mentioned in the report, Chancellor Watkins from UTAS also indicated that she would not be concerned about the addition of some more members to the council, citing an additional 2 as no concern, but as many as 6 perhaps presenting concerns about fragmentation once the numbers had grown to that extent. However, as is discussed in the report, it isn't only about raw numbers, it's about the characteristics of the council members, the method of their appointment, and the degree of representation from groups that constitute the university. So, Madam Acting President, the loss of academic, student and alumni representation on the University Council was linked to a loss of voice and influence in decision-making by university academics, especially on academic matters. There's an interesting table from Pat McConville's submission, which is included on page 67 of the report, which shows the changes at each amendment to the total council numbers and the number of staff reps on the council, and what that number is as a percentage of the total council. I found that an interesting table to demonstrate that not just a loss of raw numbers, but a loss of what could be seen as representation has occurred over the years with those amendments. And in evidence, Madam Acting President, there are many that have argued for the addition of more members to the University Council, specifying that those should be elected from the academic and professional staff and the student body. This would be a more direct link back to those who constitute the university, as prescribed in the Act. Madam Acting President, in the report you'll see the committee made recommendations relating to membership of the Council, and those recommendations were as follows. Recommendation 6, the Act be amended to provide for the constitution of the University Council to include a minimum of 2 student members, with at least 1 elected from the student body. Recommendation 7 said the Act be amended to provide for the constitution of the University Council to include a minimum of 2 members of the academic staff elected by academic staff. The Act be amended to provide for the constitution of the University Council to include a minimum of 2 members of the professional staff elected by professional staff. And the Act be amended to ensure there is more balance between the number of appointed and elected members on the University Council. The effect of those amendments would be very interesting to see, Madam Acting President. It effectively doubles the elected representation from both the academic and professional staff that is currently there in the council. It adds another student member that would need to be elected. At the moment, that's only 1 appointed role. And it points towards a need to make sure that the majority of members on the council are not appointed in a potentially self-replicating way by the council itself. Madam Acting President, the makeup of the council is closely shaped by various methods by which the members are appointed. Division 2, Section 8 of the Act provides detail on the process of making an appointment to the Council. In the university's submission, the process of recruitment was detailed with specific reference to Council academic, professional and student member vacancies. Chancellor Watkins provided the following detail on the process of appointments. She said this: "It is incumbent on us as a council to make sure we are using transparent processes to appoint council members. The composition where we have a mix of elected and appointed members is a good thing in that it gives us the flexibility to make sure we can cover all of the skills and experience needed to make good decisions in a complex organisation. The important thing is that we do use a rigorous process, particularly concerning those council-appointed decisions." End of quote. However, concerns were raised in evidence that the relative proportions of University Council members appointed by the Council versus elected or independently appointed presents a risk of consolidating power in a small number, aligned in their thinking, and less challenging debate in relation to decision making. The risk that some spoke about as groupthink, that may become an entrenched feature of the Council. John Lawrence, economist and accountant, set out the legislative basis of council appointments and its lack of a feedback mechanism. He spoke of this. How members of council are appointed is set out in Section 8 of the Act. The effect is that council itself largely determines who sits on council. A fifth column takeover by managers is not the unsurprising result of Section 8. Without a feedback mechanism from members, say, as may occur under corporations law, what's to stop council from alienating staff, students and the community, as has happened? End of quote. Madam Acting President, the relationship between the state government, the Parliament and the University Council is an interesting one. Previously, there had been a requirement that a member from each chamber of the Tasmanian Parliament be appointed to the University Council, but that was dispensed with in the 2001 amendments. Protocols attached to Commonwealth funding under the Howard federal government precluded state or Commonwealth MPs from membership of university governing bodies. However, this is not to say that there is not good reason to consider the relationship between the university as a public institution established under statute and the Tasmanian Parliament. Dr Richard Herr, in his evidence to the committee, encouraged the re-establishment of a meaningful role for Parliament, possibly through the University Council. The committee does not make a recommendation in this report to do so, although there are recommendations relating to accountability to Parliament and regular scrutiny of the university, which are addressed in term of reference 3, which I'll come to shortly. It's noted, Madam Acting President, that while the Act specifies 2 government-appointed members of the University Council, there's currently no meaningful way in which this differs from those members really appointed by the Council itself. The selection process is conducted by the university, and the convention here and in other jurisdictions similarly is that government appointments to university councils are made on basically the recommendation of the University Council themselves. In hearings, Minister Jensch drew attention to the function of government-appointed members to the Council being to represent the public interest, which he described like this, and I'll quote, "To ensure, as far as the governance structure allows and the decisions that are being made, that there are people on the University Council who the government has confidence would be working for the best interests of Tasmania as a whole as part of the University Council." He went on to say, "The merit of having positions appointed by the Minister who is part of the government is that the Minister can then apply judgment as to how those appointments can best serve the interests of the people of Tasmania." However, Madam Acting President, having made those comments, when questioned, the Minister was not able to identify the mechanism or criteria in the selection process that provides for the ministerial selections to be able to fulfil that consideration of the best interests of Tasmania. I asked the Minister in a hearing the following, and I quote, "Distinct from the board of a private company, there is no accountability of the University Council back to a broad membership or a stakeholder group, which is something we have discussed in this inquiry quite a bit. The function of ministerial appointments into the Council as representative and as bringing the public interest into that decision-making space helps to some extent to offset the fact that there isn't a group of stakeholders to which the Council is accountable, unlike a corporate board. How do you satisfy yourself that role is being undertaken by those ministerial appointments?" The Minister's far from satisfactory reply was this: "Ms Webb, the opportunity is there for the government to ensure for the positions that it has the ability to appoint that there are good people in those roles whose motives for being there and qualifications and life experience help to ensure that the Council can work in the best interests of the University and Tasmania." It's hardly any kind of firm guarantee, Madam Acting President, that those roles are actually purposefully chosen and then in an accountable way undertaking a function of bringing the best interests of Tasmania into decision making within the University Council. I note here that the committee has made a recommendation on recommendation 10 that the Act be amended to clarify the purpose and the function of ministerial appointments to the University Council. It would be better if this were clarified further in the Act, Madam Acting President. I'm mindful that this will be a long contribution, Madam Acting President, and I'll wrap up my comments on term of reference 2 by briefly mentioning it contains interesting reflections on the appointment of the Chancellor of the University as a key role on the Council. The powers and the obligations of the Council are covered, and the lack of review, scrutiny and accountability of the University Council. On that final aspect, I will note that in a range of evidence it was raised that university governance, planning, deliberations and decision-making appears to lack visibility and accountability to the students, the staff, the Parliament, the general Tasmanian community. For example, comments from Professor Brian Yates, who suggested a more open approach should be adopted for council operations. He said this: Essentially, I'd like to see more reporting to staff and students of the university, reporting to the community, and indeed reporting to government in some way. That probably is the way that University Council can demonstrate their accountability in these ways. To the external community, I guess this is where, and I'm not sure what it was like in the past, 10 or 12 years ago, but possibly making available summaries of University Council meetings or a regular update of what is going on at the University Council. There might even be, these days, opportunities to have open University Council sessions or meetings where they're broadcast or something like that for part of the time, trying to, as much as possible, open up the representation and the governing body to the community. I thought those were solid suggestions, Madam Acting President, and my understanding is, in fact, there is a little bit more openness and transparency in the fact that the minutes, I think, of council meetings in very recent years have largely been brought to light through RTI requests from Mr Robert Hogan, and that it may now be more common practice for the University Council to make public its minutes. And this is certainly a step in the right direction. It doesn't go to all those suggestions made by Professor Yates, but I think there's plenty of room to improve further. Madam Acting President, the issue of corporatisation of the university without similar corporate accountability has come up time and again in the inquiry, and it certainly did in relation to activities around University Council. And the reason there's so much time spent contemplating University Council in this report and in my contribution is that really it's the foundational and supreme governance body as specified in the Act, and a lot of the matters relating to decision-making, relating to accountability, relating to outcomes, relating to transparency flow from the way in which the University Council is configured and the way in which it operates. And certainly this issue of corporatisation alongside accountability is a key one, because it's really at the heart of what has changed in recent decades. I did note Ian Howard, who was apparently an engineering graduate of the university. In his submission, he believed the management structure of the university is subject to very little scrutiny, and I appreciated the summary he provided to make his point. He said this: the management structure of UTAS is similar to that of many public and private organisations. There is a Chancellor, Chairman of the Board, Vice-Chancellor, Managing Director, and Council, Board Directors, Executive and Non-Executive. Unlike these other organisations, the performance of the UTAS management is subject at present to little scrutiny. There are no public performance targets to be assessed against. There are no annual meetings where stakeholders and customers can question the board. There is no shareholder approval of executive salaries. There is no shareholder re-election of board members. UTAS management selects council members, with the exception of 2 state government nominees who are often its own graduates, so a perception of groupthink and agreement to the VC's initiative pervades. There are no board papers, minutes available to scrutinise the UTAS activities. In reality, UTAS's only obligations are to conform to the 1992 Act, the subject of this inquiry, and hence its importance. Other than the need to seek state government approval to borrow funds, it's almost a law unto itself. Interestingly, this latter provision has been recently bypassed since 2017 by having the Spark Living Consortium finance capital building works in exchange for future student rental income. This allows UTAS not to borrow the capital nor to have the assets on its balance sheet, and hence bypass normal state government approval. The only other permissions required are that of the Hobart City Council building approvals on an ad hoc basis, where the HCC secretly agreed to collaborate with UTAS on its move to the city. End of quote. Madam Acting President, I believe these points are well made in relation to a disparity between accountability that would be expected in a corporate world that is just simply not there when it comes to the governance of UTAS, or in fact many other universities. In a publicly listed corporate company, there'd be much greater transparency and accountability around the governing body. Shareholders would be empowered, in an empowered position to take action if there was a catastrophic failure of governance or management in the company. There's no such mechanism in relation to the university. Those who constitute the university, who make up the university, have no recourse to exercise accountability on the University Council, the Chancellor or Vice-Chancellor. Madam Acting President, Term of reference 2 also covered aspects of the Act relating to Academic Senate, which I'm not going to go into in great detail, other than to say that our examination included the membership of the Academic Senate, the functions and the role, and the review or evaluation of the Senate. Familiar themes emerged on those matters. In a range of evidence presented, the view was expressed that the Academic Senate was dominated by upper-level management, lacked a majority of elected members, and further, the Senate had a predominance of more junior academic members rather than senior staff actively engaged in significant teaching and research. The university provided considerable evidence in relation to the membership and functioning of the Academic Senate. It also indicated that this was an area in which the university was making some changes in response to some of the matters raised in this inquiry, and that was pleasing to hear. Many submissions expressed concern about the diminishing authority of the Academic Senate and the fact that the Constitution, functions, powers and proceedings of the Academic Senate are prescribed by University Council ordinances rather than being prescribed in the Act, and called for changes to be made to the Act to improve accountability and transparency, those familiar themes applying also here to the Academic Senate. And certainly, of note, I will point to page 103 of the report, and you'll find there the NTEU provided to us a selection of reflections from its members showing their opinions on the operations of the Academic Senate. They're fairly stark reading, to be honest, and hopefully do provide a really good reason to consider further reforms in that space, particularly in terms of transparency and the effectiveness of academic staff being able to have a say. The committee makes some recommendations relating to Academic Senate. Those are recommendation 12, which says that the Act be amended to prescribe key requirements for the constitution and method of appointment of the Academic Senate to ensure a higher proportion of academic representatives rather than managerial appointments and fewer ex officio appointments. And recommendation 13 was the Act be amended to prescribe the functions of the Academic Senate to include a determinative role on core academic matters, which would take it beyond its current advisory role, Madam Acting President. Moving on to term of reference 3. A central matter for consideration in the inquiry was the adequacy of the Act to ensure accountable academic, executive and financial decision-making. Evidence indicated the Act did not provide nor require appropriate accountability in relation to decision-making by the University Council or senior executive of the university. Madam Acting President, I note here a quote from Adjunct Associate Professor Therese Henning, when she reflected on this matter of executive decision-making and accountability. She said this: "The Act does not impose adequate requirements of transparency and accountability on decisions of the Council or the University senior executive, including the Vice-Chancellor, the Provost and Pro-Vice-Chancellors. Section 8.3 provides that members of Council are responsible and accountable only to Council rather than to a constituent body, even where they have been appointed or elected by a constituent body. Additionally, there's no requirement in the Act for their decisions to be communicated or justified to the university and broader community. This problem is not ameliorated by the provisions in Schedule 1 of the Act. In fact, those provisions further entrench the non-transparency and non-accountability of Council. See in particular Schedule 1, Clause 5, Council to determine its own meetings procedures. Clause 6, validity of Council acts and proceedings despite defects. And Clause 7, presumption eliminating the necessity for evidence of matters pertaining to Council." End of quote. I also note, Madam Acting President, the late Peter Bachevskis, architect and urban designer, claimed the Act was inadequate for ensuring appropriate and accountable decision-making by the university. He said this, and you'll see that there's familiar themes emerging. "The Act has proven to be totally inappropriate with regard to the university's decision-making. For example, there have been poor financial decisions over many years, e.g. building purchases, examples of waste and extravagance and overspending on property, expenditure on public relations, marketing and external consultants for non-academic related activities, lack of input by academic staff about academic decisions, lack of accountability to the community and the government when making decisions. In addition, there is no mechanism to ensure accountable executive, fiscal and academic decision-making. There are no checking/review procedures, no penalties for poor performance or providing misleading information, and there is no obligation for transparency." End of quote. There is discussion in the report about the fact that while the university rightly points to the complex regulatory environment in which it operates, a system of regulation is not the same as a system of accountability. In fact, as quoted in the report from Emeritus Professor Jeff Malpas, he says this: even were one to allow that a degree of accountability is embodied in the existing state and federal frameworks, there is an important question as to the specific respects in which accountability is exercised in this way and where such accountability is directed. The distinction between regulatory frameworks and genuine systems of direct institutional accountability is very clear within the corporate world, the same world, of course, that Australian university managers have increasingly invoked to justify their own mode of operation. Public companies also have to operate within regulatory frameworks of various kinds, but their boards, unlike the University Council, are directly accountable to shareholders. There is no such mechanism that ensures a similar level of accountability of university managers or of the university's governing council. End of quote. So, Madam Acting President, the issue when it came to decision-making around consultation and the lack thereof with staff and students was raised in evidence presented to the inquiry. Reflections were made on the need for more consultation with staff and students when making important decisions, the benefit of more genuine participation of academic staff in making decisions, and the need for more transparency and an open approach to decision-making. There is no obligation under the Act to consult with anyone in making decisions, and certainly I think over the last few years, when we have seen the university engage in quite public ways in what they describe as consultation, there's a real question mark that hangs over how genuine those processes are and where we draw the line between information sessions, genuine consultation. I think, personally, that you really have to accept that genuine consultation must provide an avenue by which a decision can be influenced, and the outcome of a decision can be influenced by those participating in the consultation. If a decision is already made, if it's predetermined, and in fact all that's happening is informing people of that decision, listening to things they have to say with no actual intention or avenue for that to then feed back to influence the result, then that is mislabelled consultation. Madam Acting President, financial decision-making by the university was a much discussed topic in evidence. Detailed submissions were made to this inquiry commenting on and raising concerns about the financial position of the university, with additional information and analysis continuing to be sent as correspondence to us across the inquiry period between 2022 and 2024. While it's clearly of significant public interest and a subject of concern for some stakeholders and community members, it's not in the terms of reference of this inquiry to make detailed analysis and assessment of the financial position of the university. The committee did note, however, and in the report mentioned, the Joint Standing Public Accounts Committee had established an inquiry into this area on the 13th of August 2024, and I do note that just today in this chamber that report has been tabled. Evidence that we discussed in this area in this report is focused on matters raised relating to accountability of financial decision-making as established in the Act, rather than making assessments about the financial situation of the university. Chancellor Watkins outlined the governance and financial management responsibilities of the Council and provided a great deal of information about how those mechanisms operate. We then, though, heard others express in evidence that the reshaping of the university operations under new business models is having a detrimental impact. The fact that elements of market rationality have been brought in. People are seeing universities more as storefronts for making money. That legislative changes by governments at state and federal levels have been pushing universities to reconfigure their governance structures, and that this has led to such outcomes that we have seen in this sector around reducing faculty and shifting to contract labour, casualisation effectively of staff, and the positioning of students primarily as customers in this space, which also I think has significance in terms of decisions made about the delivery of that learning environment. Madam Acting President, an area of financial operations that attracted a lot of attention in evidence was that of the university's borrowings. On page 116 and 17 of the report, you'll find an interesting exchange from a hearing where the member for Rumney asks Vice-Chancellor Black about the shortfall between funding from government and the costs of operating in the university. Professor Black provides an overview of why that is a particular challenge for the University of Tasmania, and he mentions the university's investment portfolio, property investments, fossil-free investment strategy, small sources of income such as rents and intellectual property. And he comments also as follows. I'll just quote briefly from him. He said, "Universities worldwide tend to be sophisticated financial investors, often setting trends because we are there for the long run, not there for the short run. We are able to do things that are much more values aligned and over the long run. Some of the most important entities are those where these values govern what we are doing, and all of that has to be possible through the current construct of the Act. The size of the university's, and end of quote, sorry, the size of the university's property investments and range of borrowing activities attracted particular comment in evidence." And I'll be certainly interested to see how the Public Accounts Committee have assessed those areas of the university's financial situation. Certainly we were provided with a lot of complex, potentially concerning information and correspondence from those who are critical of the way the university is engaging in its borrowing activity, but we also had the university provide us with information about their perspective of how that operates. It wasn't something that we as a committee were in a position to delve into with any expert approach. We were more looking at how the Act is configured in terms of what's allowable and what's not under the Act, and what accountability there is in giving effect to the Act. Madam Acting President, evidence was presented which noted and raised questions over the shift in the proportion of university expenditure which is allocated to core academic activities of teaching and research compared to expenditure on administration, including executive management. Criticism was made of a shift over time, which saw the balance move away from those core activities of teaching and research and more investment into expenditure on administration, including executive management. And in a similar vein, concerns are raised in a number of submissions relating to the inappropriately high, what people determined to be or deemed to be inappropriately high salaries for the executive management roles at the university. It was emphasised that executive management remuneration is high relative to academic salaries at the university and relative to international standards. Attention was drawn to the increase in executive remuneration occurring at the same time as academic jobs were being cut at the university. Certainly not a good look, Madam Acting President. The NTEU pointed to this discrepancy quite starkly. They said this: in 2021, the salary of the Vice-Chancellor ranked 13th of 37 VC salaries across the country. While the Vice-Chancellor is remunerated at a level that is above the national median, the same cannot be said about the staff of the university. At mid-2022, salaries of UTAS academic staff ranked 34th of 37 universities, while professional staff ranked 35th of 37 universities. End of quote. That does seem to be a problematic discrepancy, Madam Acting President. If the Vice-Chancellor ranks 13th of 37 VCs, but the rest of the staff of the university are way down the bottom at 34th and 35th. It's not a good look, especially in light of the significant casualisation, the staff losses and the underpayment scandals that we've actually seen from the university sector, including UTAS, in recent years. When asked about how decisions were made in relation to the executive and the VC remuneration, Chancellor Watkins said, "I can assure you the approach to senior salaries is a rigorous one, and it is a function of benchmarking for equivalent roles. There's always a strong focus on data. There can be considerations around a specific individual. For example, if we were trying to attract a specific individual to Tasmania, where there may be differing salary expectations, we would have some flexibility to take that into account for a very senior role, but generally speaking, like all large organisations, there's a high degree of attention paid to these matters to make sure the relativities across the relevant sectoral and size benchmarks stack up, and also the internal relativities stack up." Well, that's interesting, Madam Acting President, considering how we do appear to have a discrepancy in terms of rankings across the sector between the university Vice-Chancellor role and that of regular staff within the university. But I do also note that it's not UTAS who's unique in this concern in this space. There's The issue of executive remuneration in this sector is clearly a concern at a national level too, and it's a specific focus of a current Senate inquiry that's looking at this space. Madam Acting President, issues relating to a lack of transparency of information about decision-making was raised in this inquiry. Concerns were raised in evidence that the Act does not establish mechanisms to ensure accountability of decision-making by the Council or the Executive. Difficulties were experienced accessing information, people reported to us that they had experienced difficulties accessing information from the university through right to information requests, which also highlighted a lack of transparency and accountability. It was noted that the university is included in the definition of public authority in our Right to Information Act in this state and is therefore included in the requirements of that Act. There really is no excuse at all for the university to fall short on this front, and it invites speculation when information by which it may be held accountable is withheld from public access. Madam Acting President, a range of evidence presented to the inquiry identified the need for the Act to deliver greater accountability via the annual report of the university, including its timely publication, level of detail and scrutiny by Parliament. Many noted the significant delay in tabling and public availability of the annual report. I believe after it was discussed during the inquiry process, there was an improvement in the timeliness of tabling the 2023 annual report. However, there's an opportunity to include a more timely requirement in the Act. Comment was made in evidence that the financial report in the annual report is insufficient to adequately scrutinise financial decision-making. It was further noted the financial records of the university presented in the annual report were more indicative of a property development business and financial institution with significant money under investment as opposed to stated university activities of learning and teaching, research, knowledge transfer, research, training and community engagement. An interesting suggestion came from Emeritus Professor James Guthrie that, as a measure of accountability, in addition to the annual report, the university should be required to produce an annual budgeted statement at the beginning of each year. He said this: another one on accountability would be, rather than just having an annual report, what should be provided is by 1st of January at the beginning of the year, a budgeted statement that would specifically address the functions of the university. It would be an output-like statement where it says, we are putting this much money in for quality teaching in the next 12 months and this is what we hope to achieve. That would then be a way that people can see how they are starting to think about their functions and what they hope to do in terms of outputs and outcomes, and that would be an important document for accountability of the executive. Something like that would help in the discourse and the discussion because other people could become involved in the allocation of resources and the sort of targets they're trying to achieve. Madam Acting President, Save UTAS Campus in their submission also commented on the opportunity for greater accountability if there was a requirement for the university to produce a corporate plan for approval or scrutiny. They talked about the value that could bring if UTAS, in a similar way to the fact of GBEs like Hydro Tasmania being subject to the GBE Act, which requires them to provide to their responsible minister a corporate plan for approval if the university was treated in that similar way. Apparently the University of Western Australia Act makes the university there subject to its Financial Management Act. And they have to then, as a result of that, submit to their treasurer for approval an annual draft resource agreement setting out the services and the cost of services and other matters required to the treasurer for the financial year. So I think these are all interesting suggestions that certainly would deliver more visibility around the university's intentions, more accountability around the activities that it was undertaking and investments and financial decisions it was making. The committee agreed the value of these suggestions. We did make some recommendations in this space. Recommendation 14 was to amend the Act in relation to annual reporting by the university, including A, more specific detail on what the annual report is required to contain in relation to income and expenditure, B, a requirement to report on the delivery of the functions of the university, C, a requirement to include detail on all salaries, remuneration and fringe benefits of executive management roles at the university, and D, a requirement for more timely tabling of the university's annual report in Parliament. And then recommendation 15 was, in addition to the annual report, include a requirement in the Act for the university to produce A, an annual corporate plan to be published at the beginning of the year, and B, an annual Environment, Society and Governance ESG report. Madam Acting President, many submitters, when we were discussing these matters around the accountability of decision-making, raised the insufficiency of the Act to provide accountability for the Council and Executive back to those who constitute the University and the broader Tasmanian community, and pointed to the need for reform of the Act to require such accountability in some form. Greg Barnes, SC, member of the Tasmanian Bar, stated this in his submission. It is clear that doing nothing about the current Act is not an option, is not fit for purpose because it is inward-focused and ignores the accountability of the University to the community. The purposes of the University and the principles governing the decision-making of the University Council and management must include that regard is to be had to community views and input, and that such regard will not be relegated behind the purpose of acting in the University's interests in a narrow sense. Also, Professor Brian Yates succinctly commented on the need for greater accountability to staff, students and the community. He said, essentially, I would like to see more reporting to staff, students of the university, reporting to the community. Indeed, reporting to the government in some way. That probably is the way that University Council can demonstrate their accountability in these ways. Vice-Chancellor Black commented on the emergence of the civic universities movement and the potential for Tasmania's university to create a state-based civic compact. This was a really interesting idea, Madam Acting President, and it was pleasing that Vice-Chancellor Black brought it up. He said this about this movement. Universities around the world have recognised these challenges and in response have begun the Civic Universities movement, where universities explicitly work in partnership with their communities to meet the local manifestations of those challenges. Our strategy is very much in line with this movement. However, we haven't as yet, as many universities have done, formalised these strategic commitments in a civic compact of some form, such as those suggested through the UK's Civic University Agreement templates. We would be interested in the Parliament's vision on whether it would be a worthwhile step to do so as part of creating transparency and accountability for the role we play. I thought that was a really interesting suggestion, Madam Acting President, and one that I hope there's further discussion about actually between the University, the Parliament and the community. Madam Acting President, the University of Tasmania Act does require Treasurer approval for borrowings by the University, and this is discussed in some detail in the report. There's also discussion as to whether or not the financial position of the University represents a financial risk to the state, and various views were expressed in evidence on that. It's quite mind-boggling, really. There are differing views between the University and the state government, and I'm interested to see when we have a chance to look at the PAC report whether that's something that's addressed there. In addition to the regular borrowings by the University, which do require Treasurer approval and must be within the borrowing limit that is set by the Treasurer, it was discussed in our inquiry that in recent years the University is increasingly engaging in borrowing-like activities, such as the University's financial arrangements with Spark Living in relation to the accommodation facilities and the University's issuance of green bonds, which both sit outside the approved borrowing limit and sit outside requiring approval from the Treasurer, I believe. As a result of this discussion that we've had on that matter during the inquiry, we do make a recommendation in the report, recommendation 16, which is to review section 7.2 of the Act to retain Treasurer's approval for university borrowings and ensure it reflects contemporary borrowing and borrowing-like